Dusty's search. The Willow Creek farm was more dilapidated than the rumors suggested. Dusty Rivers reined in his mare, Ginger, and surveyed the scene. Fences sagged like tired smiles, paint peeled from the house in brittle curls, and the yard was a riot of weeds gone to seed. He'd ridden an extra 20 miles based on old whispers of a fine breeding stock, but now he wondered if he'd wasted his time. Still, he needed a reliable horse to replace the one lost in the flash flood last month, and he wasn't one to turn back without a look. He dismounted, the familiar creak of his saddle a small comfort in the unsettling silence. No chickens scratched in the yard, no cattle lowed in the distance, just the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Ginger snorted, her ears twitching, sensing the emptiness. Dusty patted her neck, a silent reassurance. Easy, girl. Just a look around. The front porch groaned under his weight as he climbed the steps. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing a shadowed interior. He hesitated, then pushed it open wider. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through grimy windows. The air inside was thick with a musty smell of decay and abandonment, a scent that spoke of broken dreams and forgotten promises. He stepped inside. The living room was a skeletal echo of its former self. Overturned furniture lay scattered across the floor, draped in cobwebs thick as shrouds. Wallpaper hung in strips, revealing faded floral patterns beneath. A shattered mirror reflected distorted images of the room, multiplying the sense of ruin. He saw no sign of recent habitation, no indication that anyone had been here in months, maybe even years. He moved through the house, each room a variation on the same theme of neglect. The kitchen was littered with rusted pots and pans, the pantry shelves bare. Upstairs, the bedrooms were haunted by the ghosts of their former occupants. A child's rocking horse lay on its side, its painted eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. In the master bedroom, a tattered wedding photograph lay on the floor, the faces of the bride and groom blurred with age and grime. He picked it up gently, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Life was fleeting, and sometimes it just vanished. Dusty replaced the photograph and went back downstairs. The barn was his last hope. He walked towards it, the crunch of dry grass under his boots the only sound. The barn loomed ahead, a dark and weathered sentinel against the pale sky. One of the large double doors hung crookedly, its hinges screaming in protest as he pushed it open. The interior was dim and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of hay, manure, and something else, something acrid and metallic that pricked at his nostrils. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, illuminating swirling dust particles. He coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. Empty stalls lined the walls, their wooden gates hanging open. Cobwebs draped like macabre decorations. He walked further inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. In the far corner, he saw a pile of old farm equipment, rusted and useless. A family of barn owls hooted softly from the rafters, their eyes glinting in the shadows. He moved slowly, his senses on high alert. He could hear the scurrying of small animals in the hayloft above, the rustle of unseen creatures in the shadows. He called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Hello? Anybody here?" Only silence answered him. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. This was a dead end. Time to cut his losses and head back to Harmony. As he turned to leave, a glint of metal caught his eye. It was coming from the last stall, tucked away in the darkest corner of the barn. Curiosity tugged at him. He hesitated, then walked towards it. The stall was overgrown with weeds, the wooden gate partially hidden by a tangle of vines. He pulled the vines aside, the rough leaves scratching his skin, and then he saw it. A metal bucket lay on its side, reflecting the faint light. And next to the bucket, a small, tarnished silver locket. It looked like it had been dropped in haste. Dusty picked up the locket. It was cold to the touch. He rubbed the grime off with his thumb, revealing a delicate inscription. He couldn't quite make out the words. He flipped it open. Inside were two miniature portraits, a young woman with kind eyes and a man with a strong jaw and a hint of a smile. He recognized the woman immediately. It was Sarah, the schoolteacher from Harmony. A chill ran down his spine. What was her locket doing here, in this abandoned place? This farm was miles from Harmony. And why did he get the distinct impression that something terrible had happened here? He glanced around the barn, the shadows seeming to deepen, to press in on him. The silence was no longer empty, but heavy with unspoken secrets. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his search for a horse had just taken a very unexpected turn. A cry in the hay. The air hung thick and still in the far end of the barn, heavy with the scent of dried grass, and something else, something faintly metallic that tickled Dusty's nose. He squinted, the already dim light fading as he moved deeper into the cavernous space. Each step crunched on the packed dirt floor, the sound amplified in the silence. He ran a hand along the rough-hewn timbers of the stalls, empty save for scattered wisps of hay. He was about to turn back, convinced the Appaloosa wasn't here when he heard it. A whimper, so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind whistling through a crack in the wall. He froze, straining to hear over the thumping of his own heart. There was again a stifled sob that sent a shiver crawling down his spine. It seemed to be coming from the last stall, the one tucked furthest into the shadows. Dusty moved cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the small knife he always carried. The stall door, warped and splintered, hung slightly ajar. He pushed it open a crack, peering inside. The stall appeared empty, piled high with hay. But the whimpering persisted, now clearer, undeniably human. "Hello," he called out, his voice low but firm. "Is someone there?" The whimpering stopped abruptly. A moment of silence stretched, thick and suffocating, then a muffled voice, barely audible, "Help me." Dusty didn't hesitate. He threw the door open wide and began to frantically toss hay aside. The air grew heavy with dust, stinging his eyes and making him cough. He dug deeper, his hands encountering something solid beneath the loose hay. More tossing, more dust. And then he saw her. A young woman, her eyes wide with fear, stared back at him. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with thick rope, and a gag was tied around her mouth, cutting into her cheeks. Her clothes were rumpled and dirty, her hair matted with hay. But even in the dim light, Dusty could see the intelligence in her eyes, the spark of defiance that hadn't been completely extinguished. "Easy now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm going to get you out of here." He knelt beside her, pulling out his knife. The woman watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He carefully sliced through the rope binding her wrists, wincing as he saw the raw red marks it had left. He worked quickly but gently, freeing her hands. As soon as her hands were free, she reached up, fumbling with the gag. Dusty helped her untie it, and she gasped for breath, her chest heaving. "Thank you," she croaked, her voice hoarse. "Thank you so much." "What happened?" Dusty asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. She hesitated, her gaze darting around the stall as if she still expected someone to jump out of the shadows. They took me," she whispered. "I don't know who they are or why." "Who took you?" Dusty pressed, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "Can you tell me their names?" She shook her head, tears welling up at her eyes. "I didn't see their faces. They blindfolded me. Just please get me out of here." Dusty nodded, understanding dawning in his mind. This wasn't a simple case of a missing horse. This was something far more dangerous. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Sarah Bell." Dusty helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed slightly. "Come on, Sarah Bell," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Sarah's story. Sarah burrowed deeper into the rough wool blanket Dusty had provided, its meager warmth struggling against the barn's persistent damp. Each groan of the aged beams, each skitter in the lofted hay, sparked renewed tremors. Her voice, when it emerged, was a mere breath. 3 days passed, returning from town, just beyond McCready's place. They materialized, 3 masked figures. Yanked me from my saddle, bound me tight, tossed me into a wagon's bed. She paused, swallowing against a throat thick with fear, her gaze skittish as she scanned the barn's shadows. Dusty dropped to one knee, his face etched with a severe gravity. A man of immense stature, she mused, capable of bone-crushing force, yet his eyes held a surprising tenderness. Did they harm you, Sarah? She shook her head, a solitary tear carving a clean streak through the grime on her face. Not physically, more terror. They kept ordering me to be silent. She scrubbed at her cheek with the blanket's edge. They hauled me to their hideout, tucked away in the foothills, past Devil's Canyon, a den of unsavory characters, drinking, gambling, simply biding their time. Dusty's jaw hardened. Awaiting what? Sarah inhaled raggedly. They intend to plunder the town, Dusty, tomorrow eve, during the dance. With everyone distracted, they plan to raid the bank, the mercantile, everything. The barn air seemed to thicken, to solidify with dread. Dusty's silence was a tangible weight, heavy with consideration. Anxiety clawed at Sarah. Would he dismiss her as hysterical? Would he offer assistance? They never stopped talking about it. She pressed on, her voice gaining a fragile strength. How effortless it would prove to be. The bounty they'd reap. They exuded arrogance. They even possessed a meticulously drawn map of the town, each target clearly indicated. She squeezed her eyes shut, recalling the raucous laughter, the cloying stench of stale liquor and sweat. I was tethered in a tent, under guard. I overheard plans to abandon me in the canyon, afterwards a red herring to draw attention. Dusty's hand closed around hers, his touch surprisingly gentle and grounding. You're secure now, Sarah. They won't touch you. His voice, a low rumble, settled her jangled nerves. Rising to his full height, he cast a long silhouette across the rough-hewn floor. He paced, brow deeply furrowed in thought. How many, Sarah? Can you estimate their numbers? I would wager 15, perhaps pushing 20, and they were well equipped. Rifles, revolvers, even a few shotguns. Dusty seized his restless movement, his gaze locking onto hers. We must alert the town, but charging in now will signal your escape. They may alter their strategy, or worse, inflict harm searching for you. A fresh wave of apprehension crashed over Sarah. What course do we take? Dusty's eyes, now flinty with resolve, met hers. We thwart them, but with careful planning. We must find a way to communicate with the sheriff without alerting them. And we require men willing to stand alongside us. Kneeling again, he spoke with an earnest intensity. Sarah, I promise you, I will not allow them to harm anyone. I'll exhaust every avenue to stop them. Gazing into his eyes, she perceived not just raw strength, but a deep reservoir of empathy. For the first time since her ordeal commenced, a tiny spark of hope flickered within her. Thank you, Dusty, she barely whispered. Thank you. He gave her hand a brief, reassuring squeeze, then stood. Foremost, we must get some food into you. Then we must devise a plan to salvage this town. He turned and strode toward the barn doors, his broad shoulders squared with purpose. Sarah watched him depart, a strange cocktail of fear and resolve churning within her. The outlaws might be plotting to rob the town blind, but they had failed to account for Dusty Rivers. And perhaps, just perhaps, that oversight would prove their downfall. Pip and the map. The air in the barn hung thick with the smell of hay and something else, something acrid, like fear. Dusty scanned the stalls, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Empty. Every single one. Panic clawed at his throat. He needed a horse. Sarah needed help. Where are they? He muttered, his voice tight. He moved further in, pushing aside a dangling piece of frayed rope. The only sound was the skittering of mice in the rafters. Then he saw him. In the last stall, tucked away in the corner, stood a small, dun-colored pony. He was barely bigger than a large dog, with a thick, tangled mane and wide, worried eyes. He looked utterly forlorn. Well, hell, Dusty said, the disappointment heavy in his voice. Sarah shuffled in behind him, her face pale in the dim light. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill. Horses? Are they gone? Dusty nodded grimly. Looks that way. I'll accept him. He gestured towards the pony. Sarah stared at the small creature. A pony? We can't ride a pony all the way to town. Despair laced her voice. Dusty ran a hand through his hair. He knew she was right, but he couldn't let her see him waver. He's all we've got, Sarah, and he looks strong enough. We'll make do. He approached the pony slowly, extending a hand. Easy there, fella. The pony flinched but didn't bolt. Dusty gently stroked his nose. His coat was rough and matted with mud. Looks like you got left behind, didn't you? He felt a strange pang of sympathy for the animal. He turned back to Sarah. Think you can handle a pony ride? She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know. I haven't ridden in years. Well, today's the day to start again. Dusty tried to sound more confident than he felt. He grabbed a discarded saddle blanket from a nearby hook and tossed it over the pony's back. The pony shifted nervously but remained still. As Dusty worked, Sarah wandered towards the far end of the barn, her footsteps hesitant. She stopped near a rickety wooden table, its surface littered with dust and debris. Dusty. Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned to see her holding a piece of crumpled paper. What is it? She brought it closer to the light, filtering through a crack in the wall. It was a map, crudely drawn with charcoal on a piece of tanned hide. Lines snaked across the surface, marking trails and rivers. X's were scrawled at various points, each labeled with a single word: Carson, Bridge, Riverbend. Dusty took the map from her trembling hand. His eyes scanned the markings, recognizing landmarks in the surrounding area. The X's, they had to be targets. This is a plan, he said, his voice grim. A plan for something big. He pointed to the Riverbend marker. That's where the stagecoach usually stops. They're planning to rob it. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just about stolen horses anymore. This was about something much more dangerous. Sarah's eyes widened. Robbery? But why leave this behind? Dusty frowned. Maybe they were in a hurry. Maybe they thought no one would find it. Or maybe, he trailed off, a chilling thought forming in his mind. Maybe they wanted us to find it, to draw us into something. He looked at the pony, still patiently waiting. Looks like our little friend here just became our only hope. He knew then that buying a horse was the least of his problems. He had a map, a scared woman, a miniature pony, and a gang of bandits planning something big. He took a deep breath. He also had a rancher's grit and a whole lot of determination. It would have to be enough. The journey begins. The morning dawned gray, mirroring Sarah's spirit. She sat stiffly on Pip's broad back, clutching Dusty's worn leather jacket around her like a shield. The silence between them was a heavy blanket, woven with unspoken fears and lingering trauma. Dusty led Pip by the reins, his face set in a grim line. He'd offered to let her ride double, but she'd refused, needing the small distance, the illusion of control. The first few miles were deceptively gentle, a winding path through fields dusted with the gold of late summer. But soon, the land began to climb, the easy path dissolving into a tangle of scrub brush and loose shale. Pip, sure-footed and strong, navigated the treacherous terrain with surprising grace. Sarah, however, was not so steady. Each jolt sent a fresh wave of nausea through her, a cold fist clenching in her stomach. "We'll stop soon," Dusty said, glancing back at her. His voice was low, a rumble against the wind. "Just need to get over this ridge." The ridge was a cruel joke. It wasn't a ridge so much as a jagged spine of rock, forcing Pip to pick his way carefully along a narrow ledge. The wind howled, whipping Sarah's hair across her face and stinging her eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the rising panic. The smell of dust and horse sweat filled her nostrils, a suffocating reminder of the barn. "Sarah, look at me," Dusty commanded, his voice sharp but laced with concern. He stopped Pip, turning to face her. "Don't look down. Look at me. Tell me what you see." She opened her eyes, focusing on his face. The lines etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, the glint of determination in his gaze. He was solid, real, a beacon in the swirling chaos of her mind. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "That's right. Me, and Pip, and this stupid ridge. We're going to get through this, Sarah. I promise." He urged Pip forward, and she clung to the horse's mane, focusing on Dusty's back, on the steady rhythm of his boots on the rocky ground. The ridge seemed to stretch on forever, each step a monumental effort. Finally, they reached the crest, and the land opened up before them, a vast expanse of rolling hills and scrub-dotted plains. Dusty dismounted, tying Pip to a stunted juniper bush. He reached up to help Sarah down, but she flinched away, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice like warm honey. "I won't hurt you." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. He helped her dismount, her legs trembling beneath her. He led her to a small patch of grass, sheltered from the wind. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the ground. "I'll get some water." He returned a few moments later with a canteen and a handful of dry jerky. Sarah took a sip of water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She nibbled on the jerky, the salty taste grounding her. "We need to talk," Dusty said, settling down beside her. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "About what happened?" Sarah's stomach clenched again. She shook her head, unable to speak. "I know it's hard," Dusty continued, his voice gentle. "But we need to figure out who did this to you, Sarah, and why." I don't know," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "I don't remember much." Dusty nodded. "That's okay. We'll take it slow. Anything you remember, anything at all, could help." He waited patiently, giving her time to gather her thoughts. The wind howled around them, but in that small patch of grass, there was a fragile sense of peace, a shared understanding, the beginning of a journey, not just across the harsh landscape, but into the dark corners of Sarah's memory. The broken bridge. The trail dwindled to a thread, clinging precariously to the ravine's edge, where gnarled scrub, oak, and gaunt pines clawed at the stony soil. Sarah, still ashen and clutching the blanket Dusty had given her like a lifeline, faltered. He steadied her with a touch to her arm, his rough palm surprisingly tender. "Almost there," he murmured, though their destination remained a vague promise in his own mind. He just needed to keep moving, her too, putting distance between them and whatever torment haunted her gaze. Then the bridge vanished. Or rather, the bridge itself remained, mocking them with its incompleteness. Where sturdy planks should have spanned the chasm, a dizzying emptiness yawned, the legacy of decades of relentless water. The creek gurgled below, its sound apathetic and chilling. Sarah recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips. Dusty cursed, the sound muffled. A complication he hadn't factored in. Turning back was untenable. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Stay put," he commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor. He needed her confidence, not her panic. He crept toward the fractured edge, scrutinizing the remains. The supports seemed frail, consumed by rot. One wrong move, and the whole structure could give way. Kneeling, he tested the remaining timbers with his boot. They groaned a warning, but held. A quick scan of the surrounding woods revealed a stroke of luck, the aftermath of a recent storm. Scattered branches lay like discarded spears, some thick and substantial. "We'll get across," he stated, the words meant to soothe her more than himself. Shedding his denim jacket, he tossed it to her. "Wear this. You're freezing." He began the work, his movements efficient and honed by experience. He dragged the largest branches he could manage, their coarse surfaces rasping against his skin. He strained with each pull, a sheen of sweat prickling his forehead despite the biting air. Sarah observed him in silence, her eyes wide, still echoing with untold horrors. He felt her constant scrutiny, a weight he bore with each lift and heave. He avoided her gaze, focusing intently on the task at hand, knowing she was close to the edge, teetering on a precipice of raw nerves. He lashed the branches together with strips torn from his shirt, his only recourse. The process was painstaking, his numb fingers fumbling with the makeshift cordage. He wove the branches into a rudimentary platform, testing its stability with his full weight. Imperfect, certainly, but it offered a slender hope. He turned towards Sarah. "I need you to be strong now," he said, his tone deliberately gentle. She winced, but nodded faintly. I'm going across first. Then, I'll help you. Can you do that? Her eyes searched his, desperate for reassurance. He offered a tight smile. I know you can. Gingerly, he edged onto the precarious bridge, his weight eliciting a chorus of creaks and groans from the beleaguered planks. He moved with painstaking slowness, his gaze locked on the far side. He felt the wind buffeting him, the sickening void below. Reaching the other side, he anchored the rough-hewn platform to a gnarled root. All right, he called out, his voice tight with strain. Your turn. Slow and steady. One step at a time. I'm here. Sarah hesitated, her face a porcelain mask. She placed a tentative foot on the bridge, her hand reaching toward him. The planks protested again, the sound amplified in the stillness. She froze, a strangled breath escaping her. It's all right, he soothed, his voice a beacon in the storm of her fear. Just breathe. You got this. She took another step, then another. Her progress felt glacial, each movement a monumental achievement. He saw the stark terror in her eyes, the trembling in her outstretched hand. Yet, she persisted. Finally, she stood beside him. He enfolded her in his arms, holding her close. She clung to him, shivering uncontrollably. He felt the frantic rhythm of her heart against his chest. You did it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You were incredible. He held her for a long moment, allowing her to regain her composure. Then, gently, he guided her away from the treacherous edge, deeper into the sheltering woods. Their journey was far from over. The bandit hideout. This way, Sarah urged, tugging at Dusty's sleeve, a glint of determination sparking in her fear-stricken eyes. A shortcut. They won't anticipate it. Dusty hesitated, his original plan to skirt the ridge in plain view abandoned under the force of her conviction. Lead the way. She navigated the dense scrub oak with surprising agility, its branches like grasping claws against his jacket. The air hung stagnant, thick with the earthy aroma of damp soil and decaying foliage. Down a faint deer trail they plunged, each footfall crunching on the parched undergrowth, punctuated only by a distant crow's mournful cry. His hand remained close to the revolver nestled in his waistband. After a grueling descent, they emerged into a small, rock-strewn clearing. Sarah halted, raising a hand. There, she breathed, indicating a cluster of boulders at the far end. They're holed up there. They call it the Devil's Tooth. Dusty narrowed his eyes. A faint plume of smoke spiraled from behind the rocks, accompanied by a low hum of voices. How do you know all this? Sarah recoiled, her voice barely a whisper. They talked, believed I couldn't hear or wouldn't comprehend. A shiver traced her spine, despite the oppressive heat. Dusty crouched, signaling Sarah to follow suit. The exposed clearing offered scant cover, but the afternoon sun offered a degree of concealment, hindering observation from the shadowed rocks. They inched forward, reaching a fissure in the boulders that provided a vantage point. The bandits had established a crude camp at the base of the formation. A lively fire painted the rough faces of the men gathered around it with flickering light. Dusty counted 5, their expressions hardened and their faces unshaven. He recognized the scarred brute who had led the horses from a barn. Easy score, the scar man rumbled, his voice gravelly. River spread is ripe for plunder. Too busy playing do-gooder to guard his own livestock. A weasel-thin man with lank, greasy hair chuckled. And the girl? Did she spot anything? She's gone. The scarred man spat, contempt lacing his words. Took off. Good riddance. Besides, we'll be long gone before anyone can connect her to us. A wave of fury washed over Dusty. His grip tightened on his revolver. He yearned to burst in, guns blazing, but knew impulsiveness would be a fatal error. Sarah's safety depended on him. We hit the river's place tonight, the scarred man continued. Strip it bare. Horses, cattle, provisions, everything. By dawn, we'll be across the border, fencing it all to Ramirez. Ramirez, someone repeated, the name hanging heavy in the air. The gaunt man rubbed his hands together greedily. A king's ransom. Finally, a payoff worth the gamble. Dusty stole a glance at Sarah. Her face was ashen, her eyes flinty. He could only imagine the torment of hearing them so casually discuss their scheme, her fate dismissed so readily. "They're going to rob your ranch," she breathed, her voice lost in the snap and crackle of the flames. He offered a grim nod. He'd anticipated this, but hearing it laid bare, the reality struck with chilling force. He had to get back, warn his men, prepare a defense. He carefully retreated from the edge of the clearing, pulling Sarah along. "We need to leave," he said, urgency tightening his voice. Now, they slipped back into the undergrowth, moving with hushed speed. The image of the men, reveling around their fire, seared itself into his memory. He had to thwart them. He had to safeguard his ranch, ensure Sarah's security. This was no longer simply a matter of a stolen horse. This was about justice, protecting his own, and exacting retribution for their transgressions. Dusty's plan. Dusty Rivers studied the abandoned bandit camp, the air thick with the ghosts of burnt coffee and hurried departures. The ground was a mess of discarded playing cards, gnawed bones, and the embers of a dying fire. He kicked at a dented tin can, sending it skittering across the packed earth. Finding his horse had become secondary. Now it was about righting a wrong, about bringing these lowlifes to justice. And maybe, just maybe, finding out why Sarah Bell had been targeted in the first place. "They're predictable," Dusty muttered, more to himself than to Sarah, who sat huddled near the edge of the clearing, a worn blanket wrapped tightly around her. He could practically smell the routine. Rob, drink, gamble, repeat. Idiots. And predictable idiots were vulnerable. Predictable how? Sarah's voice was small, barely a whisper, but the question hung in the air like smoke. Dusty squatted beside her, his voice low and steady. "They set a trap, right? Back there on the road?" Used you as bait. He waited for a nod, her eyes still wide and haunted. "We're going to use their own trap against them." Her gaze flickered from the blanket to his face, a flicker of hope replacing the deadness he'd seen there before. "Ow! Remember that old swayback nag they were riding? The one they called Pip?" Sarah nodded again, a faint smile touching her lips. He was slow but loyal, and they won't expect him to be anything but a harmless old horse. Dusty stood, dusting off his worn leather chaps. "We're going to give Pip a little mission." The plan was simple, brutal in its simplicity. Dusty would lead Pip back toward the road where they'd been ambushed. He'd leave Pip tethered, looking lost and alone, a tempting target for the returning bandits. Only this time, Pip would be rigged. Dusty worked quickly, his fingers nimble despite the urgency that thrummed beneath his skin. He dismantled the remnants of the bandits' own rope trap, carefully reassembling it near Pip. Instead of a noose meant to ensnare a horse and rider, this one was designed to collapse a pile of logs, creating a barricade across the road. A tripwire, nearly invisible against the dusty ground, would trigger the release. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, watching him work. The color was slowly returning to her face, replaced by a cautious determination. "As sure as I can be," Dusty replied, his voice tight. "It's a risk, but it's the best chance we've got." He checked the rigging one last time, ensuring the logs were precariously balanced, ready to tumble at the slightest tug. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing, painting the scene in hues of orange and deepening purple. Time was running out. "All right, Pip," Dusty murmured, patting the horse's flank. "You're a brave son of a gun, you know that." Pip just swished his tail, oblivious to the role he was about to play. He led Pip back towards the road, Sarah following close behind. The air grew heavy with anticipation, each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, amplified in the tense silence. Dusty tethered Pip to a scraggly bush near the bend in the road, making sure he was clearly visible. "Stay here," he instructed Sarah, pointing to a thicket of trees. "Out of sight, but where you can see what happens." He moved swiftly, melting back into the shadows. Sarah disappeared into the trees. Dusty found his own hiding place behind a cluster of boulders, the rough stone digging into his back. He drew his revolver, the cold steel a reassuring weight in his hand. The weight was agonizing. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues before surrendering to the darkness. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Every sound was a potential threat, every shadow a lurking enemy. Then he heard it, the distant rumble of horses' hooves growing steadily louder. He gripped his revolver tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. They were coming. Justice in Willow Creek. The moon, a sliver of ice in the inky sky, offered just enough light to see. Dusty checked the ropes one last time, hidden behind a thicket of sagebrush. Sarah, her face pale but determined, nodded from her position 20 yards away, near the abandoned cabin. Their plan was simple, if audacious. Lure the bandits back to their hideout, then spring a trap. Dusty let out a low, mournful whistle, mimicking a lost traveler. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then a twig snapped. He saw them emerge from the cabin, 3 figures silhouetted against the darkness. They moved cautiously, rifles held ready. "Hold it right there," Dusty yelled, stepping into the clearing, hands raised. "I'm lost, and my horse threw a shoe." The bandits exchanged glances. "Well, ain't that a stroke of luck?" The leader, a burly man with a scar bisecting his left eye, sneered. "Come on over here, friend. We'll see if we can help you out." Dusty edged closer, feigning fear. He could feel Sarah's eyes on him, a silent promise of backup. He reached into his pocket, pretending to search for tobacco, and subtly flicked open his knife. As the bandits closed in, Dusty made his move. He lunged forward, slashing the rope that held the heavy log suspended above the trail. The log swung down with a sickening thud, knocking the leader off his feet. Simultaneously, Sarah emerged from the shadows, firing a warning shot into the air. The remaining bandits, momentarily stunned, hesitated. Dusty tackled the closest one, wrestling him to the ground. Sarah quickly disarmed the third, her movements surprisingly swift and efficient. Within minutes, all 3 were securely bound, their own bandanas used as gags. "You all right?" Dusty asked, helping Sarah to her feet. She nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let's get them to town." The ride to Willow Creek was silent and tense. Dusty led Pip, the stout horse carrying the 3 bound bandits, while Sarah rode alongside, her rifle across her lap. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of orange and gold as they approached the town. News of their arrival spread like wildfire. People poured out of their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a perpetually weary expression, stared at the captured bandits with disbelief. "Dusty Rivers, I'll be," he sputtered, shaking his head. "You actually caught them." "With a little help," Dusty said, gesturing to Sarah. The sheriff turned his attention to her, his eyes softening. "Miss, I don't know how to thank you. These fellas have been terrorizing this town for months." Sarah simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the dusty street. The ordeal had clearly taken its toll. Later, after the bandits were safely locked away in the town jail, Dusty found Sarah sitting on a bench outside the general store, staring blankly ahead. "They'll be brought to justice, Sarah," he said, sitting beside her. "You made sure of that." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "What am I going to do now, Dusty? I have nothing." Dusty thought for a moment. "You could stay in Willow Creek. I could use some help on a ranch. It ain't much, but it's honest work." Sarah considered his offer. The thought of returning to her old life, to the memories that haunted her, was unbearable. Perhaps a new start, a fresh beginning, was what she needed. "What kind of work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything you want to do. Tend to the chickens, help with the garden, maybe even learn a ride." He paused, then added, "You'd have a place to stay, food to eat, and you'd be safe." A flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's eyes. She looked at Dusty, his face weathered but kind, and made her decision. "I'll stay," she said, a hint of a smile gracing her lips. "I'll work hard, I promise." Dusty smiled back. "I know you will, Sarah. I know you will." He stood up and offered her his hand. "Come on." Let's go home.